I watched in horror as the bulldozer ripped through my prize-winning rose garden, the same roses I had spent 3 years nurturing, the same garden where my daughter took her first steps. The machine operator did not even look at me as he destroyed everything I had built. The HOA president stood behind me with her arms crossed and a satisfied smile on her face. She had finally won, or so she thought. "You should have just accepted our generous offer," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Now look what you have forced us to do." I turned to face her, my hands shaking with rage. But I did not say a word, because at that moment I already knew exactly how I was going to destroy her and everything she represented. That was the day I decided to donate their entire office building to charity. And let me tell you, it was the sweetest revenge I have ever tasted. My name is David, and I thought I had found paradise. After 20 years of working 60-hour weeks in corporate America, I had finally saved enough money to buy my dream home. 3 acres of beautiful land in Meadowbrook Estates, a quiet suburban community where children rode bikes in the streets and neighbors actually knew each other's names. The house was nothing fancy. A simple 2-story colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch. But it was the land that stole my heart, rolling green hills that stretched to a small creek at the back of the property, ancient oak trees that provided perfect shade in the summer, and enough space for the vegetable garden and workshop I had always dreamed of building. I spent every weekend that first year transforming the property. I planted the rose garden where the bulldozer would later destroy my dreams. I built raised beds for tomatoes and peppers. I installed a small pond with a fountain that my wife Lisa said sounded like heaven. This was not just a house. This was our sanctuary. The kids loved it too. My 8-year-old daughter Emma would spend hours catching fireflies in the backyard. My son Jake, who was 12, finally had room to practice baseball without worrying about breaking a neighbor's window. For the first time in our married life, Lisa and I could sit on the back porch after dinner and actually hear ourselves think. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in October. I was drinking my coffee and watching the sunrise over the creek when I noticed something strange. 2 men in hard hats were walking around my property with surveying equipment. They had clipboards and were pointing at different areas of my land while making notes. I walked outside in my bathrobe and slippers to see what was going on. "Excuse me," I called out. "Can I help you with something?" The older man looked up from his clipboard. "We are just doing some measurements for the HOA, nothing to worry about." "Measurements for what?" I asked. He exchanged a look with his partner. "You should have received a notice in the mail. We are surveying for the new community train track project." My blood turned cold. "What train track project?" The man looked uncomfortable. "I think you need to talk to the HOA office. We are just doing the survey work." They finished their measurements and left me standing in my backyard, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. I ran inside and started searching through the mail from the past few weeks. There, buried under credit card offers and grocery store flyers, was an official envelope from the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I tore it open with trembling hands. The letter was written in formal legal language, but the message was clear. The HOA was planning to build a decorative train track that would run through several properties in the community, including a significant portion of my backyard. The project was described as a beautiful addition that would increase property values and provide enjoyment for all residents. But as I read further, my heart sank. The train track would run directly through my rose garden, my vegetable beds, and the area where I had planned to build a workshop. According to the letter, construction would begin in 60 days, and property owners would receive fair compensation for any landscaping that needed to be removed. I read the letter 3 times, hoping I had misunderstood something. But there was no mistake. The HOA was planning to destroy everything I had worked so hard to create, and according to the fine print, they had the legal authority to do it. That night I could not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, researching HOA powers and property rights until the sun came up. What I learned made me sick to my stomach. When I bought the house, I had signed documents giving the HOA certain easement rights over my property. I had not paid much attention to those pages of legal jargon. I trusted that the HOA would only use those powers for reasonable community improvements like utilities or drainage. I never imagined they would use them to build a train track through my backyard. The next morning, I drove to the HOA office to demand answers. The building was a modern glass structure at the entrance to our community, designed to look impressive and intimidating. As I walked through the front doors, I felt like David approaching Goliath. The receptionist was a young woman who looked bored and annoyed that someone had interrupted her phone scrolling. "I need to speak with someone about the train track project," I said. She sighed and picked up her phone. "Margaret, there is someone here about the train thing." She hung up and pointed down a hallway. "Conference room B, she will be right with you." Margaret Thornfield was everything I expected and worse. A woman in her 60s with perfectly styled gray hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. She wore a business suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and she carried herself like someone who was used to getting her way. "Mr. Chen," she said, extending a manicured hand, "I understand you have some concerns about our community improvement project." "Concerns," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You want to build a train track through my backyard. You are going to destroy everything I have built." Margaret sat down across from me and opened a thick folder. "I understand your attachment to your landscaping, but we have to think about what is best for the entire community. This train track will be a beautiful addition that increases property values for everyone." "But why does it have to go through my property?" I asked. "There are other routes you could take." Margaret's fake smile never wavered. "The engineering study showed that this is the most cost-effective path. Do not worry, we will provide fair compensation for any plants that need to be removed." "Those are not just plants," I said, my voice rising. "That is 3 years of work. That is my daughter's favorite place to play. You cannot just put a dollar amount on that." "I understand you are emotional about this," Margaret said, in the condescending tone adults use with children. "But the decision has already been made. The board voted unanimously to approve the project." "When was this vote?" I demanded. "I never received notice of any board meeting." Margaret flipped through her folder. "The meeting was held last month. All residents were notified according to our bylaws." I never got any notification. "According to our records, a notice was posted on the community website and in the newsletter." I felt my face getting hot. "You mean the newsletter that gets delivered with 20 other pieces of junk mail, and the website that nobody ever checks? You made a decision that affects my property and my family, and you buried the notice where no one would see it." Margaret's fake smile finally slipped. "Mr. Chen, I can see you are upset, but raising your voice will not change anything. The project has been approved and construction will begin as scheduled. You can either work with us or make this difficult for everyone." I left the HOA office feeling like I had been punched in the stomach. But as I drove home, anger replaced despair. Margaret Thornfield had made a mistake. She had shown me exactly who she was. A bully who used legal technicalities to get her way, hiding behind bylaws and procedures to avoid any real accountability. That evening, I started making phone calls to my neighbors. What I discovered made my blood boil. The Johnsons 3 houses down had lost their deck to an HOA beautification project 2 years ago. They were told it was not aesthetically pleasing and had to be removed. The Garcias on Elm Street had been forced to remove a fence that had been there for 15 years because it violated some obscure rule about boundary markers. Every family I spoke with had a horror story about Margaret Thornfield and the HOA board. They ruled our community like their personal kingdom, using their authority to settle personal grudges and line their own pockets. The train track project, I learned, was being built by a construction company owned by Margaret's brother-in-law. But what made me angriest was how powerless everyone felt. You cannot fight the HOA, people kept telling me. They have unlimited money and teams of lawyers. They will just keep dragging you through court until you give up or go broke. I spent that night researching Margaret Thornfield and the other board members. What I found was a pattern of corruption and abuse of power that went back years. Contracts awarded to family members. Community funds used for personal expenses. Selective enforcement of rules based on personal relationships and grudges. The HOA was not a community organization. It was a protection racket run by petty tyrants who had tasted power and become addicted to it. And Margaret Thornfield was their queen. As I closed my laptop that night, I made a decision. I was not going to be another victim who rolled over and accepted their fate. I was going to fight, and I was going to win. The first thing I learned about fighting an HOA is that it costs money, a lot of money. The lawyer I consulted, Robert Martinez, was honest about my chances. HOAs have broad powers, he explained during our first meeting. When you bought your house, you agreed to certain covenants. The question is whether they are exceeding those powers. But they are destroying my property, I protested. That has to be illegal. Not necessarily, Martinez said, pulling out a thick folder. I reviewed your HOA documents. There is language about community improvements and maintenance of common areas. If they can argue that this train track falls under those provisions, you might not have much recourse. The retainer fee was $5,000. Just to get started. Martinez estimated that fighting the HOA could cost anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000, depending on how long it dragged on, and there was no guarantee we would win. But I had no choice. I wrote the check and prepared for war. The first few months were a blur of legal documents, depositions, and court appearances. I learned a new vocabulary of easements, covenants, and injunctive relief. I spent my evenings reading legal briefs instead of playing catch with my son. I spent my weekends in law libraries instead of working in my garden. The HOA, as expected, had unlimited resources. They hired a team of lawyers from a downtown firm that specialized in property law. They filed motion after motion, trying to delay the case and run up my legal bills. Every response cost me money I did not have. But we did find some cracks in their case. The train track project had never been properly surveyed for environmental impact. The construction company they hired was not properly licensed for this type of work. And most importantly, the board vote that approved the project may have violated open meeting requirements. We have a shot, Martinez told me after our third court hearing. The judge seemed interested in the procedural violations. If we can prove they did not follow proper notification requirements, we might be able to get an injunction. For a brief moment I felt hope. Maybe the system would work. Maybe justice would prevail. That hope was crushed at the next hearing. The HOA produced a stack of evidence showing they had technically followed all notification requirements. The notices had been posted exactly where the bylaws required, even if no one actually read them. The meeting had been properly announced, even if it was scheduled at a time when most residents could not attend. Technically, they had followed the rules. The fact that they had done so in a way designed to avoid actual community input was irrelevant from a legal standpoint. The court finds that the defendant HOA has complied with all procedural requirements, the judge announced. The plaintiff's motion for injunctive relief is denied. I sat in that courtroom feeling my world collapse. Months of fighting, thousands of dollars in legal fees, and countless hours of stress, all for nothing. The law was on their side, even when their actions were morally wrong. But Martinez was not giving up. "We can appeal," he said. "There are still arguments we can make about the scope of their easement rights." The appeal would cost another $15,000, money I did not have. I had already taken out a second mortgage on the house to pay legal fees. Lisa was working extra shifts at the hospital to help cover expenses. We were drowning in debt to fight for a principle that the courts did not seem to care about. That night, I sat in my backyard looking at the rose garden that would soon be destroyed. The legal system had failed me. The community had abandoned me. I was running out of money and running out of options. But I was not ready to give up. There had to be another way to fight back. I just had to find it. The bulldozers arrived on a Monday morning in March. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee cup shaking in my hands, as three enormous machines rolled onto my property. Behind them came trucks full of workers and equipment. The invasion had begun. I ran outside in my pajamas, desperate to stop what was happening. "Wait," I shouted. "You cannot do this. We have an appeal pending." The foreman, a big man with calloused hands and tired eyes, looked uncomfortable. "I am sorry, sir. We have our orders. The legal injunction was denied." "But this is my property. This is my garden." "I know, and I am sorry. Nobody likes this part of the job, but we have a contract to fulfill." I watched in horror as the first bulldozer moved toward my rose garden. The operator looked like he would rather be anywhere else. This was not his fight, and he knew he was destroying something precious. But he had his orders too. The blade of the bulldozer bit into the earth where I had planted my first rose bush 3 years ago. The plant that Emma had helped me choose at the garden center. The bush that had produced the most beautiful pink blooms every spring. In seconds, it was gone, buried under a pile of dirt and debris. One by one, my roses disappeared. The vegetable garden where I had grown tomatoes that tasted like sunshine. The herb garden where Lisa picked basil for her famous pasta sauce. The small apple tree we had planted for Jake's 10th birthday. Everything I had built was being erased. Margaret Thornfield arrived around noon to supervise the destruction. She stood at the edge of my property with her clipboard and her satisfied smile, checking items off her list like she was grocery shopping. When she saw me watching from my porch, she walked over. "This could have been so much easier if you had just cooperated," she said. "We offered you fair compensation for your landscaping. Instead, you chose to waste everyone's time and money on lawyers." I stared at her, unable to speak. How do you reason with someone who sees the destruction of your dreams as a minor inconvenience? "The train track will be beautiful," she continued. "Your property values will increase. In a few years, you will thank us for this improvement." "Get off my property," I finally managed to say. Margaret's smile widened. "Actually, this part is not your property anymore. This is now a community easement. I have every right to be here." That night I sat in my empty backyard, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I had worked for. The area looked like a war zone. Piles of dirt, broken concrete, and the remains of my plants scattered everywhere. The peaceful sanctuary where my family had found happiness was gone. Lisa found me there at midnight, sitting on the steps of the back porch. She did not say anything, just sat down beside me and took my hand. We had been fighting about the legal bills and the stress of the lawsuit for months, but in that moment, all our arguments seemed petty. "I am sorry," I whispered. "I failed. I could not protect our home." "You did not fail," she said. "You fought. That is more than most people would have done. But look what it cost us. The legal bills, the stress, the fights, and for what? They won anyway." Lisa squeezed my hand. "Maybe they won the battle, but this is not over." She was right. As I sat there looking at the destruction, something shifted inside me. The legal system had failed me. Traditional methods of fighting back had proven useless, but that did not mean I was powerless. Margaret Thornfield and her board of bullies thought they had won. They thought they had broken me, but they had made a crucial mistake. They had shown me exactly who they were and how they operated, and in their arrogance, they had given me the information I needed to destroy them. I stood up and walked to the edge of where my garden used to be. The bulldozers would be back tomorrow to continue their work, but while they were building their precious train track, I would be building something else. A plan for revenge so perfect, so poetic, and so legally bulletproof that Margaret Thornfield would never see it coming. Revenge is a dish best served cold, but planning it requires a white-hot fury. For the next 3 months, while the HOA finished destroying my backyard and building their ridiculous train track, I became a different person. I was no longer David the homeowner trying to protect his garden. I was David the strategist, and Margaret Thornfield had just become my full-time job. I started by studying everything about the HOA's finances and operations. Public records showed they managed an annual budget of over $2 million collected from homeowner fees. But more importantly, I discovered they owned significant assets, including the office building where Margaret held court like a petty dictator. The HOA office building was worth approximately $1.8 million. It sat on prime real estate at the community entrance, a monument to bureaucratic power that Margaret had insisted on building 3 years earlier. According to the public records, the building was owned outright by the HOA Corporation, with no mortgage or liens. But here is what Margaret did not understand about property law. She was so focused on using easements and covenants to control homeowners that she never considered how those same legal principles could be used against her. I spent weeks researching charitable donation laws and tax regulations. What I found was beautiful in its simplicity. Under IRS regulations, property can be donated to qualified charitable organizations, and the donor receives significant tax benefits. But more importantly for my purposes, once property is legally donated to a charity, it cannot be easily reclaimed. The key was finding the right charity. It had to be an organization that would accept the donation, put the property to good use, and most crucially, one that would make Margaret's life as difficult as she had made mine. I found the perfect match in the Riverside County Community Food Bank. They were a well-established 501c3 organization that provided meals to low-income families throughout our area. Their current facility was cramped and outdated, and they had been looking for a new location for years. The HOA office building would be perfect for their needs. I met with Sarah Williams, the director of the food bank, at a coffee shop 20 miles from my neighborhood. I did not want to risk anyone from the HOA seeing us together. "This sounds too good to be true," Sarah said after I explained my proposal. "You want to donate a $1.8 million building to us. What is the catch?" "No catch," I said. "I have a legal way to make this donation, and your organization deserves a better facility to serve the community. It is a win-win situation." Sarah was intrigued but cautious. "How exactly would you be able to donate a building that you do not own?" I pulled out the folder of research I had compiled. HOA boards are elected by the homeowner community. As voting members of that community, homeowners have certain rights regarding the disposal of community assets. Under specific circumstances, those rights can be exercised to redirect assets for charitable purposes. It was more complicated than I made it sound, but the legal foundation was solid. I had found a loophole in the HOA's own bylaws that allowed for emergency asset transfers under certain conditions. The process required careful timing, specific documentation, and absolute secrecy until the moment of execution. Over the next 6 weeks, I worked with Sarah and her lawyers to prepare all the necessary paperwork. We conducted building inspections, filed tax documents, and established a timeline for the transfer. Every detail had to be perfect because we would only get one chance. The psychological shift during this period was incredible. For months, I had felt like a victim, constantly reacting to Margaret's attacks and scrambling to defend my property. Now I was the one setting the agenda. I was the one with the plan. I was the hunter instead of the prey. I also began building a network of support within the community. The other victims of Margaret's reign of terror were eager to help, even if they did not know the full scope of what I was planning. Mrs. Garcia helped me document HOA violations and financial irregularities. The Johnsons provided information about board meetings and internal communications. A dozen other families contributed pieces of the puzzle. The final piece of the plan involved timing. I needed to execute the donation at a moment when the HOA board would be unable to respond quickly. Their next board meeting was scheduled for the third Thursday of June, and I knew from my research that Margaret would be out of town the previous week for her annual vacation in Europe. Everything was falling into place. The legal documents were prepared. The charity was ready to take possession. The community support network was in place. All I needed was the perfect moment to strike. As I sat in my rebuilt backyard that evening, looking at the ugly train track that now ran through my former garden, I smiled for the first time in months. Margaret Thornfield thought she had won. She thought she had taught me a lesson about challenging authority. She was about to learn a lesson herself, about the danger of underestimating a man with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The morning of June 15th will forever be etched in my memory as the day justice finally prevailed. Margaret Thornfield was somewhere in Italy, probably sipping wine and congratulating herself on another successful year of terrorizing homeowners. She had no idea that back home, her empire was about to crumble. At exactly 9 a.m., I walked into the HOA office building with Sarah Williams and her legal team. The receptionist, the same bored young woman who had dismissed me months earlier, looked up from her phone with confusion. "We are here to take possession of this building on behalf of the Riverside County Community Food Bank," Sarah announced, handing over a thick envelope of legal documents. The receptionist blinked several times, clearly not understanding what was happening. "I am sorry, what?" "This building has been legally donated to our charitable organization," I explained, unable to keep the satisfaction out of my voice. "We are here to begin the transition process." The next few hours were chaos. The office staff frantically tried to reach Margaret, who was unreachable somewhere in Europe. The assistant HOA manager, a nervous man named Bill who had always been terrified of Margaret, kept reading and rereading our legal documents with growing panic. "This cannot be legal," he kept saying. "You cannot just take our building." But it was legal. Completely, perfectly, beautifully legal. The emergency provision in the HOA bylaws that allowed for asset transfers during board absences. The community petition signed by 67 homeowners requesting the donation for charitable purposes. The proper IRS documentation establishing the tax-exempt status of the transfer. Every I was dotted, every T was crossed. By noon, news of the donation had spread throughout the community. My phone was ringing nonstop with calls from neighbors who could not believe what was happening. Some were concerned, some were confused, but most were delighted. Finally, someone had stood up to Margaret Thornfield and won. The local newspaper arrived around 2 p.m. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, had heard about the story through social media. "Is it true that you donated the HOA office to charity?" she asked. "The community donated the building," I corrected. "I simply facilitated the legal process. The Riverside County Community Food Bank does important work helping hungry families. This building will serve a much better purpose as their new headquarters." The story hit the newspaper's website that evening and went viral within hours. Local television stations picked it up the next day. By the end of the week, the story had spread to national news outlets and social media platforms across the country. The headlines were everything I had hoped for. "Homeowner donates HOA office to charity in ultimate revenge." "David versus Goliath. How one man fought back against HOA bullies." "HOA office becomes food bank after property dispute." But the real satisfaction came from watching Margaret Thornfield's reaction when she finally returned from vacation. I happened to be driving past the building when her car pulled into the parking lot that Tuesday morning. Through my rearview mirror, I watched her storm out of her car and march toward the entrance, only to find it locked with a sign reading, "Riverside County Community Food Bank coming soon." The phone call came 20 minutes later. Margaret's voice was shaking with rage. "What have you done? What have you done?" "I donated your building to charity," I said calmly. "The community felt it would be put to better use helping hungry families than housing bureaucrats who abuse their power." "This is illegal. This is theft. I will have you arrested." "Actually, it is completely legal. Your own lawyers have already confirmed that all proper procedures were followed. The donation is final and cannot be reversed." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought she had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "You have destroyed everything we built." "No," I replied. "You destroyed it yourself when you decided to bulldoze my garden for a vanity project. I just redirected the pieces toward something worthwhile." The legal challenges came as expected. Margaret hired 3 different law firms to try to reverse the donation. They filed lawsuits, appeals, and emergency motions. They claimed fraud, conspiracy, and breach of fiduciary duty, but every challenge failed. The donation had been executed perfectly, and there was no legal remedy. The HOA was forced to operate out of a small rented office space in a strip mall 20 miles away. Their budget was decimated by legal fees and the loss of their primary asset. Board meetings that used to be held in a luxurious conference room now took place in a cramped space above a discount tire shop. But the most beautiful part of the victory was watching the community transform. Without Margaret's intimidating office building as a symbol of authority, homeowners began to speak up about years of abuse and corruption. A reform movement emerged, led by the same neighbors who had helped me gather evidence for the donation. Within 6 months, Margaret Thornfield and 2 other board members had been voted out of office. The new board immediately began revering years of petty rules and vindictive policies. They canceled several unnecessary projects, including the train track that was never completed due to budget constraints. The Riverside County Community Food Bank moved into their new headquarters that fall. I attended the grand opening ceremony, watching families line up for free meals in the same building where Margaret used to plot her next victim. The conference room where she had dismissed my concerns now served as a distribution center for groceries. Her private office became a storage room for donated clothing. It was poetic justice in its purest form. 2 years have passed since I donated the HOA office building to charity, and the transformation of our community continues to amaze me. The Riverside County Community Food Bank now serves over 3,000 families per month from their beautiful new headquarters. What used to be a symbol of bureaucratic oppression has become a beacon of hope for struggling families throughout our region. Margaret Thornfield moved away 6 months after losing the building. Rumors say she relocated to a retirement community in Arizona where she cannot terrorize homeowners anymore. The assistant manager, Bill, who turned out to be a decent man once freed from Margaret's influence, now works as a bookkeeper for a local small business. The rest of the old HOA board either resigned in shame or were voted out by angry homeowners. The new HOA board, led by my neighbor Mrs. Garcia, operates with transparency and genuine community focus. They hold monthly meetings in the community center, with agendas posted online and input welcomed from all residents. The budget is published quarterly, and major decisions require community-wide votes. It is everything a homeowners association should be. The train track project was officially abandoned after the budget crisis caused by losing the office building. The partially completed tracks were removed, and the affected properties were restored at HOA expense. My backyard looks better than ever. I replanted my rose garden, and this spring it produced the most beautiful blooms I have ever seen. Emma, now 10 years old, still loves to play among the flowers, and she often tells her friends about the time Daddy fought the bad people and won. But the impact of our victory extends far beyond our community. The story of the HOA office donation has inspired homeowners across the country to stand up against abuse of power. I receive emails weekly from people facing similar battles with tyrannical HOA boards. While I cannot provide legal advice, I always share the same message. Research your options, build community support, and never underestimate the power of creative thinking. The legal precedent we established has been cited in several other cases involving HOA disputes. Property lawyers now refer to the Meadowbrook strategy as an example of how community members can reclaim power from corrupt boards. Law schools use our case study in courses about property rights and nonprofit law. Most importantly, I learned that fighting injustice is not just about winning or losing. It is about refusing to accept that powerful people can abuse others without consequences. When I stood in my destroyed garden that day, I could have given up. I could have accepted that Margaret Thornfield was too powerful to defeat. Instead, I chose to believe that there had to be a way to fight back. The key was understanding that traditional methods are not always the answer. Courts and lawyers and political processes often favor those with more resources and better connections. But creativity, persistence, and careful planning can level the playing field. The same laws that protected Margaret's abuse of power also provided the tools for her downfall. I also learned the importance of community. No one person can defeat a corrupt system alone. But when neighbors support each other and work together toward a common goal, amazing things become possible. The dozens of homeowners who helped gather evidence, sign petitions, and spread the word were just as important to our victory as any legal strategy. Today, when I sit on my back porch in the evening, I look out at my restored garden and feel profound satisfaction. Not because I got revenge on Margaret Thornfield, though that was certainly satisfying, but because we proved that bullies can be defeated, that corrupt systems can be reformed, and that ordinary people have more power than they realize. The train track is gone. Margaret Thornfield is gone. But the community food bank continues to serve families in need every day, operating from a building that once housed petty tyrants and now shelters hope. Sometimes the best revenge is not destruction, but transformation. We took something ugly and made it beautiful. We took a symbol of oppression and turned it into a force for good. And that, more than any legal victory, is what justice truly looks like.